What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and if you've spent any amount of time on YouTube or Twitter or Reddit, you've probably seen a lot of comments from people complaining about the state of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And these comments are not new. People have complained about the state of the game for a very long time. Pretty much anytime a new rule comes out or a new mechanic is added, people aren't going to be happy. In today's video, I want to try and answer the question, is Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually getting worse? Now, for a bit of context, I have been playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Since 2002. I have been playing since LOB, in fact, so I've seen the game go through many changes throughout the years. In today's video, I want to look at 3 different categories of old versus new school Yu-Gi-Oh! Yes, there are other categories, but these are the 3 that I see come up the most often in comment sections, and I'm going to try to give my best answer as to, was it better back in the day or is it better nowadays? Keep in mind, there is no right answer here. This is completely subjective. You don't have to like or dislike any form of Yu-Gi-Oh! Old or new. It's completely up to your decision. I've even brought in a few of my YouTube friends to help answer these questions so that they can give their own unique perspective about these topics. Links to all of their channels will be in the description below. The first category is budget. This is one that comes up a lot. People say that new school Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a lot more expensive than it ever was back in the day. And I believe the answer to this question is a bit complicated because it depends on if we're talking about rogue level decks or casual decks or competitive decks or the top tier decks in the format. I'll say this, I think at the top end of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you're really playing super competitive decks, the game has always been very expensive, no matter which time period you're looking at. In terms of playing casually or playing rogue decks at locals, I feel like the game nowadays is a lot more budget friendly than it was like 10-15 years ago. In my opinion, as someone who used to be on a very tight budget, especially back in high school, the game didn't have nearly as many reprint sets as it does nowadays, and I feel like those reprint sets really help out budget players of all levels, competitive, casual, and everywhere in between. Now, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I'd love to see even more reprints of top tier staple cards, but compared to like 15 years ago, I feel like one of the other big differences is that nowadays, if you can't afford a top tier staple card, there probably is another option in the game that's very similar. Maybe you can't afford 3 copies of Pot of Prosperity because they're $100 a piece. Well, for less than 1 copy of Pot of Prosperity costs, you can buy a playset of Pot of Extravagance because those are only at $30 a copy. Maybe you also can't afford that. Well, then you have options like Pot of Desires, which has been reprinted a ton of times, which has made it so that there are multiple prints of Pot of Desires that cost less than $2 a copy. So there are options out there where back in the day, because the game had less cards, if you didn't have a card like Mere Force, there wasn't really a substitute. And I remember back in the day really needing a copy of Mere Force, but it was simply too expensive. Yeah, I could play Sakuratsu Armor, but Sakuratsu Armor is a lot worse than Mere Force. It only destroys 1 monster instead of all of my opponent's attack position monsters. But I feel like nowadays you do have a number of options to play instead of pretty much every single expensive card. Of course, if you want to play at the highest caliber, you'll probably need those really expensive cards, but sometimes you can still get away with not playing them. To help answer this question, I've also brought in Farfa in House of Champs. Farfa has played Yu-Gi-Oh! Since 2013, so he has a more modern perspective on the game. He's been playing almost 10 years, but House of Champs has played since 2002, so he's kind of coming from the same perspective as I am, and he's kind of known as the market watch guy, so he knows all about budgets throughout the game's history. Let's see what they have to say about how expensive the game is compared to back in the day.
Without a doubt, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is as easy as it's ever been to be able to get involved in the new competitive game. Compared to before where you'd have to spend hundreds and hundreds to play a meta deck, Nowadays, you can usually get the main archetype deck itself for a fairly decent price, but realistically, it's the staples that are going to hit your pocket these days. Now, the thing is, on the plus side, is that while you might have really expensive cards such as a droplets or whatever, these can easily be replaced with much cheaper cards that kind of, for the most part, do the same thing, and obviously don't hit your bank account that hard, like a Chalice, for example, would work well in that scenario. I think Yu-Gi-Oh's come a long way for a while now, and it's definitely way more accessible than it's ever been, but that's not to say it couldn't get better. But if you are interested in getting involved in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, it's definitely easier than it's ever been.
What's good, YouTube? And welcome to Dzeeff's channel. Doug has asked me a simple yet complicated question that has two sides of a coin, I believe, and that's, is Yu-Gi-Oh more budget friendly than back in the day? I think for entry level Yu-Gi-Oh, it's actually a lot worse, trying to play on a budget and not just get smashed at locals. While you have options, they're way more few and far between, and Rogue has gotten way more expensive. But meta Yu-Gi-Oh has always floated between $600 to $1,200, with some exceptions of Yu-Gi-Oh being way more expensive or way cheaper at 2 points in its life. You have Mechanical Chaser at the very beginning of Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament Pack 1 being $600 for a playset for just 50 more attack over La Jin and 7 colored fish. Mirror Force was a $50 to $60 card. Jinzo was a $60 card. Imperial Order also secret rare out of here, no slouch. People griped and groaned over Smashing Ground being an $8 common out of Invasion of Chaos. That's funny verse today, isn't it? Then you have Blackluster Soldier at 60 and Chaos Emperor Dragon at 60. And we're just to 2004 Chaos with all these expensive options, skipping over even beatdown formats. You fast forward to 2008, you have Dark Arm Dragon release. It goes to $300 a piece with Allure at 60. You have Destiny Draw at 60, and not to mention Malicious at 60, but also prize cards at $2,000 a piece, an actual part of the metagame for Crush Card and Gold Star. Fast forward to Duelist Revolution, look at the three cards here: Effect Veiler, Solemn Warning, and Pot of Duality. You know these names even today. Pot of Duality was $120 back then, and we really get into this pacing of $120 secret rares that happens over and over. But now you look at today, $10 commons thanks to Tri Brigade on Rescue Cat, despite you have 6 different versions of this card. You also look at Ash Blossom, guaranteed in 2 products, yet still a $20 card for all versions, if not more expensive. Ghost Spell, Drone Lockbird. It comes down to hand traps and extra deck cards, I feel like, for today's Yu-Gi-Oh being a lot more expensive, where the extra deck wasn't as big a part of Yu-Gi-Oh back in the day, but it became there ever since Synchro format, really. So there are budget options around. They're few and far between, but you've got to pick and choose where you give up power for money if you are on a budget in this game. It's definitely worse than back in the day, but let's not pretend like it's completely gone away. I feel like budget has gone from $50 back in the day to being about $150 today.
The second comment I see a lot of is all about deck diversity. A lot of people think that modern Yu-Gi-Oh is way less creative than it was back in the day. And a lot of people say that back in the day, you could pretty much play whatever cards you had and you could still do good. I think the biggest area where people get maybe confused about this question is that people are thinking about when they played at recess or maybe when they played at locals. And yeah, in those cases, even nowadays, you can pretty much play whatever you want and you'll probably do all right. However, at a competitive level, even back in 2003, you had to play some pretty standard cards to see any amount of success. Yeah, you might be able to get away with less good decks and less good cards at locals and stuff like that, but at the highest level of competition, you pretty much had to play a standard deck. There really was a metagame even back in 2003. All you have to do to find this out, by the way, is go back and look at the 2003 World Championships, where a lot of people are playing almost identical decks. So I think throughout the years, we've had tier 0 formats where you basically have to play the best deck or you'll lose, and we've had formats with a ton of topping decks. It's no one's fault, of course, but I feel like when people think back to old school Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of the time they're thinking about playing against their friends at recess or playing at locals, when in reality there were competitive events going on, they just weren't attending them. And I totally get that. Back in 2002, I was not going to bigger events either, but I can look back and say, okay, my experience playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Against my friends wasn't really what was going on at competitive tournaments. To help answer this question, I've invited Joe from the YuGiOh History channel. He has been playing this game since 2003. He has a ton of tops, and right now his channel is all about profiling older decks and talking about their context in this game's history. So he is very knowledgeable on formats from back in the day, and I think he is the perfect person to help answer this question.
Really, to answer this question, we need to define old school because it can vary per person. For me, old school is the early 2000s when I started playing. To me, old school is running against Spear Dragon and Gemini Elf and Goblin Attack Force, while for some people, old school might only be 10 years ago, looking at windups versus Insectors and Rescue Rabbit variants. So it really depends on when you define old school versus new school, because very old school, a lot of the times when you went to locals or even regionals, people ran what I like to call good stuff decks, at least before the advent of Chaos Monsters, where someone might have a Blade Knight in their deck or an Azura Priest, maybe they liked Injection Fairy Lily, maybe they liked Exiled Force, but decks didn't have that overwhelming degree of synergy that you start to see in the mid to modern Yu-Gi-Oh days. And then as things progressed and Konami started to release clear and good archetypes, the diversity in the game shifted because good stuff decks as were originally constituted started to fade away. I'm talking about sort of the later 2000s, and then things like Destiny Heroes started to become archetypes that people focused on and built decks around. And then when we start to look at the archetype era in Yu-Gi-Oh, oftentimes there's only 4 or 5, at least in the middle stages of Yu-Gi-Oh, 4 or 5 top archetypes. So if we're looking at the late 2000s and early 2000s, and we talk about deck diversity, we're looking at usually 5 or 6 archetypes that were pre-made by Konami that would be classified as top tier. And then when we compare that to modern Yu-Gi-Oh, I would say I find modern Yu-Gi-Oh! A little bit more diverse as a whole. This is very format specific because if we go back to, for example, 2014, that format is very diverse with a lot of archetypes, whereas some of the even more recent formats, I'm looking at things like Zodiac format, where one archetype was just so oppressive, it really was the only top tier or very close to one of the only top tier decks. So by and large, I would say modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a little bit more diverse, particularly if we're talking about the current format. But I think a large portion of that is a byproduct of the fact that so many more cards have been released and so many more archetypes have been released, and it's seemingly every other set where we're seeing 2 or 3 different archetypes that you could very conceivably play against, even if they're not the absolute top tier. I'm talking about things like Plunder Patrols, Amazements, S-Force, etc. Decks that are clearly not tier 1 right now, but when you walk into a tournament, you could conceivably run into just because there's so many archetypes that have simply been printed over the course of the past 20 years.
The final category has to do with barriers to entry. How hard is it to pick up Yu-Gi-Oh! As a new player versus back in the day from a gameplay standpoint? Basically, I think the answer here is pretty obvious. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is way more complicated than it was back in the day. Honestly, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is more complicated than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. The game has gotten way more cards, it's gotten way more complicated rulings, and while I think things like problem-solving card text do help out compared to especially the really early cards as we've looked at in the weird Yu-Gi-Oh! Card Effect series, overall I think the game can be pretty scary for new players. I will say though, one positive thing about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that we have a lot more resources nowadays to help players out. There are tons of YouTube videos that explain combos or explain the metagame or give deck profiles or explain rulings. We have Facebook groups where people can ask judges questions to figure out how card interactions work, and there are so many other groups online as well. There were forums back in the day, like Pojo especially, where people did that type of stuff, but I think nowadays we have way more options available. I do feel like with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! We have a lot of resources to help out newer players, but overall I think the game is a lot more complicated than it was back in the day, and I think it can be pretty difficult for a new player to pick up. So to summarize, I feel like the game has always been pretty expensive at the highest end of competition, but But at a local level and a casual level, I feel like the game is a lot cheaper for players nowadays than it was back in the day, primarily because of all of the reprints that happen these days compared to old school Yu-Gi-Oh! As for deck diversity, I feel like no matter what time period you're looking at, you'll have diverse formats, and you'll have tier 0 formats, and you'll have formats that are somewhere in between. And finally, in terms of how easy it is for new players to pick up Yu-Gi-Oh! Even if we do have more resources to help you out these days, the game is still quite complicated, and this is probably one of the biggest complaints about new school Yu-Gi-Oh! Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Remember, this is all about our subjective opinions, but make sure to put yours in the comment section below if you agreed or disagreed with what I had to say in today's discussion. I'm sure there are going to be a number of people who disagree, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comment section below. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.
It's definitely easier than it's ever been.